My friends in Christ, it's a beautiful day in Florida, Peace Lutheran Church, as God has gathered us again for a little bit of history, to come together to be able to share some of the stories from the people who helped plant Peace Lutheran Church. I, as the pastor, have only a short time to continue as the pastor of Peace Lutheran Church. In 6 days, I'll officially retire. And on that seventh day, I will preside at Holy Communion as the final act of being the pastor of this wonderful church that I've been privileged to serve as the midwife for, as God planted it. I came here in 1999 after serving a redevelopment church in Pittsburgh, Hope Lutheran Church in Cranberry Township. But that was my second call. My first call was at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Sewickley, Pennsylvania. When I served at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Sewickley, Pennsylvania, I kept hearing discussions about a quilt that had been designed and fabricated when the church was built in 1917, a very difficult time. That congregation was actually started by Austrian immigrants who served as maids and servants to the wealthy of that area. And so they were working very hard to raise money. And so what they came up with was a project. For 10 cents, you could have your name sewed into this quilt. And then there was another drawing for which people bought tickets, where they would find out who would be the winner of that quilt. Well, that happened many years before I served there at that church. And the legend was that someone in one family had the quilt because they had won it many years before. But no one knew where it really was. Well, one day I was very blessed to receive a letter from a couple in the state of Maine saying, "We have the quilt from the organization of St. Paul Lutheran Church in Sewickley, and we wish to return it to you." Everyone who knew that story was very, very blessed, and we found a prominent place in the facility to hang it. And there was a sense of coming home, looking at the names of all the people that had helped to plant that church, and for the sacrifice that they had done in order to do it. When I came to be the pastor-developer of Peace Lutheran Church, that quilt came back into my mind from St. Paul, Sewickley. And as I talked to the organization team of Peace Lutheran Church, I said, I'd like to do something visible that will be a historical memento of the people that have helped to plant this church, because they have indeed been used by God. And so each person was given a square of cloth. We asked them to put their name on it and where they were from, the state primarily, as well as something that might tell a little bit of the story of who they were in their lives and who they were for us here at Peace Lutheran Church. This project was all put together, and if you look behind the quilt, you will see that it was done in 2003. We were organized in January 2003. I served as a pastor, and the co-chair of this project for the organization Quilt were Clarice Hendrickson and Rachel Vold. I know they worked very hard on this project, and they were thankful when it was done. And I was told, Pastor Wolder, that's enough organizational quilt for a while at Peace Church. And so this is the only one we've ever done. What I'd like to do today is just take you through these people who are represented here on the square. We had over close to 180 people who were a part of the organization of the congregation. Many of them gave squares, but some were not able to. But all their names are listed in our records. I begin with the first couple, Ray and Rachel Vold. As you heard earlier, Rachel was the one who helped to put the project together. Rachel was a gifted seamstress and loved to sew and loved quilting. Her husband Ray was an executive, a vice president of a corporation, And he loves hunting, and for many years they had a cabin together that they shared in the state of Wisconsin. They're also the donor for our Noah window that we have blessed in the church. Rachel died several years ago, and so we miss her very much, but Ray at this time is a very active member of our congregation. Next we come to Kurt and Winnie Kammer. Kurt was a pilot with Eastern Airlines, and Kurt was Jewish. Winnie was a Lutheran, and so they would often come together to hear the stories that we shared here at Peace Church, and they liked it very, very much. Winnie especially loved the hymn sings that we would do at our church. The next couple are Vern and Lee Linder. And it says on there, "May the peace of the Lord be with you always." Vern and Lee were very special people in our congregation, and they are the donors for the miracle window in our church. Lee contracted polio when she was just a very young mother and lived her entire life in a wheelchair. Vern and Lee were able to navigate many things and obstacles in life that for many of us, that they found ways to get around. Late in life, Vern also needed a wheelchair, and so sometimes in the wintertime we would see them going down the sidewalks of McGregor Boulevard from their home in Kelly Greens. They wanted to get out and to enjoy life. I just want to read a bit of a story that Lee wrote about her life that is in our archives that I thought would be helpful to us to hear. "I looked down at my green upholstered wheelchair and gave thanks for this marvelous invention that enables me to go about my way without the aid of my legs. I give thanks for life that has been so good. No one could have convinced me that I would have a better life. I know my handicap has made me a better person, for I now possess a feeling of inner appreciation, somehow feeling luckier than everyone else. I've been given a better understanding of life." That perspective from Lee Linder was a message that touched and inspired all of us. We next move on to Ron Kranick and Barb Ware. I believe that they were from the state of Illinois. Stan and Rusty Geiser were very wonderful, gifted leaders of our church. Stan, one of the stories Stan loved to share was that he and Rusty came to a dinner that we had where we were trying to gather gifts from our leaders to help us purchase a piece of land, actually across the street from where we are now, what was called the Watson Farm. The day that we were to have that dinner, the owner said he would not make a deal with us, and we were very disappointed. But we still came together that night saying we didn't know where we were going to be located, but we were going to build Peace Lutheran Church with God's help in Fort Myers, Florida. Stan, as he was leaving, said, "You know, Pastor Walter, that was the most expensive dinner I've ever been to." We were very blessed by the generous gifts of those leaders that helped to set the pace for continuing to always excel in the campaigns and the stewardship programs of this church. Rusty is still an active member of our congregation and of our choir. Phyllis Stein is pictured here with a beautiful red cardinal. The thing I remember most about Phyllis was that she loved to make lemon chiffon pies. Lemon meringue pies, I should say. They were absolutely delicious. And even after her death, her family sent us her recipe. Marv and Ann Swanson were from Des Moines, Iowa, and we were very blessed that they had their home congregation become a mission partner with us at Peace Lutheran Church and help us in our early years. Sue Gates was a member of our congregation and an artist, and so she has a very beautiful painting here. Don and Pat Nodell were wonderful people. They came to us one day saying, Pastor Walter, I saw in the Lutheran that you're planning a new congregation in Fort Myers, Florida, and we want to be a part of it. Don and Pat brought us many gifts. Pat was on the Synod, worked with the Synod Constitutional Committee in the Maryland-Delaware Synod of the LCA, and she brought us gifts to help us to pull together our first constitution. I'm always grateful for her work in that area. Don and Keneen Weymouth are friends of Sen and Rusty Geither from Indianapolis. Both Stan and Don worked at Eli Lilly in Indianapolis and have blessed us in many ways. Don is originally from the state of Maine and has a lovely cabin there that my family and I have enjoyed. Ursula Sahakten was from Germany originally, and she was a hairdresser in our area and really enjoyed being a part of our church. Katie Karen is actually my aunt. And Aunt Katie was one who helped to raise all of us, my four brothers and sisters and myself, back in Corey, Pennsylvania. And when she heard that I was going to be doing this work, well, she wanted to support us also, as well as be a part of this organization, Quilt. Frank and Darlene Warner have blessed us in so many ways. They came here in the early 2000s when we were still meeting the Masonic Temple. And I recognize in Frank an incredible gift of leadership. He shared with me that he had been on the Bishop Chilstrom's Mutual Ministry Committee, dealing with many difficult issues that they faced. And I thought that was a leader that would really bless Peace Lutheran Church. And Frank did. I still remember when he said, Pastor, want to come over to our house and tell us what you're doing and tell us about this building project. And so I bought over a whole bag of blueprints. And in the end, after explaining to Frank and Darlene what was happening, I said, Frank, we really need a leader for this project. Will you consider it? And I was so thankful when he called and says, Walter, I'll help you, not only through one building project, but two building projects, and now also serves as the chairperson of our call committee of our church. We have been greatly blessed by Frank and Darlene Warner. Marian Zotke was from, I think, Eli, Minnesota, and the loons on, I think it's Lake Vermilion, are something that she often talked about. June Troger was a person who actually was a part of the work on Sanibel to plant a Lutheran church, and she is still a part of our congregation. Irene Storvis and she were sisters. They're Finnish and are wonderful people, and I'll come to the Storvises in a few moments. Here we have Pastor Everett Bunk and his wife Dorothy. I'm deeply connected with Pastor Bunk because when I was an intern at Redeemer Lutheran Church back in the late 1970s here in Fort Myers, my supervisor was called to another congregation, and rather than moving, Pastor Bunk, who was the pastor-developer of Christ Lutheran Church in Cape Coral, became my supervisor. And so it was so exciting to come back to Fort Myers and to reconnect, and he loved to see how Peace Lutheran Church was being developed. He died several years ago, and Dorothy has moved to a facility in Tallahassee. But Pastor Bunk was a real colleague and a partner who loved to see what was happening in growing the Church of Jesus Christ. Here is my family, myself, Elizabeth, my wife, and our daughters, Frances and Carol. When we came to Fort Myers, Frances was entering the 6th grade and Carol was the 4th grade. Now Frances has 3 daughters in Des Moines, and Carol's engaged to be married in Brooklyn, New York next year. And you can see I was then still in love with Revelation 22 and the Tree of Life. Judy is from Hill City, Minnesota, and has a picture of winter. Cliff and Phyllis Baca are wonderful people. I think Cliff worked for Northwestern Airline. He's died several years ago, but Phyllis is still in our area. Jerry and Sherry Chrisman are folks from Fort Myers, And Jerry worked in the air conditioning business, and so gave us a lot of advice on how we could economize and put in a very efficient air conditioning here in our first facility. Jerry Pilmer was from Aurora, Illinois, and came to us and had great leadership gifts. And Jerry has also now died to the Lord. Tom, Shane, and Kim and Danielle Heindel. Well, one Sunday, I'll tell you their story. When we were meeting in the Masonic Temple, this young couple came in, Tom and Kim, with about a 2-year-old son, and we saw that Kim was pregnant. She had to walk in front of the whole set of chairs that we were sitting on, bleachers, and you could just kind of watch the people's eyes, all grandparents watching the Heindels. They sat down, and the people certainly embraced them, and they became a very important part of our church. And Kim has now gone on to become an associate in ministry, a deacon of our church. And Danielle was the first person who was baptized in our church while we were still at the Masonic Temple. George and Lois Frank, Pastor George served at Peace Lutheran Church as an outreach of Christ Lutheran Church in Cape Coral for 3 years before I was appointed as a pastor developer, and he did an outstanding job. He had a connection here with a member of our church who was from his congregation in New Jersey, and so God led them together, and Pastor George created a great foundation for this church to be built on. And he's very much involved now in helping to plant the new mission in Babcock Ranch, because he feels that we as a church need to be on the front edge of planting churches. Ed and Jenny Boland were wonderful people. They were from Chicago area. I remember Ed and Jenny always talking about the church that they came from in Chicago, that they had tried to plant different trees from the Bible to be able to tell the Bible story. Both of them died after they retired from this area and had moved to Door County. Ralph and Edith DeBusk lived on Sanibel, and they were great. Ralph was a great canoeer. He loved to go out into the wilderness of Sanibel. And from the great state of Tennessee, Ralph was a chemist. Everett and Marilyn Root. Everett has now died into the Lord, but they have on here coffee hour, because Everett worked with Pastor Frank and said, Pastor Frank, if we're going to grow the church grows on the bellies of the people. You got to feed them. And so Everett was able to help to pull together dinners that people came to love. And he even got a shopping cart that he found, and all of our coffee pots and other things had to be put away every week when we were at the Masonic Temple, and they were put in this shopping cart that Everett had found. And quite honestly, when we moved here, I returned the shopping cart because I wasn't sure how much he had paid for it. George and Lois, or Patty Fisher, are wonderful people out of the Milwaukee area. George has died. He loved to play the accordion. And Patty, or Lois, is still our crucifer. And she says that whenever she's here doing that, she feels just filled with the Lord. Gladys Dixon was from Michigan, and we were very blessed because Gladys was the first person to make a bequest to the legacy fund for our church. She was a beautician and very proud of her beautiful hair that she would wear every time she came to church. Gladys was a beautiful person. Mary Louise Beckstrand is pictured here next. Mary Louise Beckstrand was last out of Door County, but her family actually has connections to a professor at Gettysburg Seminary that I came from. And the unique story of her, about Mary Louise and her husband Garfield, was that Garfield Beckstrand was to be the pastor from Christ Lutheran Church in Cape Coral to come and to work on planting Peace Lutheran Church, to help to see if there was enough people here to create a new church. As they were preparing, and this must have been back in the early 1990s, to come to Fort Myers to start that ministry, Garfield died of a heart attack. And continue to, and we were very blessed, and that's why Pastor Frank stepped in to be the pastor developer. And our pulpit is given in honor of Pastor Beckstrand. He served a large, he left. Art and Nancy Keller were from Wisconsin. And here's Paul and Irene Storvis. They were very involved in trying to plant a Lutheran church on Sanibel Island, and they were very disappointed. Irene once shared with me that the reason why she felt that the church did not work on Sanibel was certainly there was the expense of the land and finding a land. But she said, Pastor Walter, many of the Lutherans that came to Sanibel in the winter were a part of other congregations. And sometimes pastors are afraid to let their sheep go to something else. And so that's why one of the insights I gained from her is why perhaps the mission was not successful on Sanibel. But she rejoiced that it was successful here on this side of the river. Connie Griffin was a wonderful person that came to our church and lived with us here as the people of God. Eva Wicks was a good friend of Gladys Dixon, also from Detroit. Eva escaped from Germany after the Holocaust, after all the war there, and she came to America, and she would often speak about the notion of religious freedom. She spoke with a very heavy German accent, and for many years she was a lector at our church, and she spoke very precisely and helped us to hear the word of the Lord. John and Mary Kent, here pictured with an organ, are very important leaders of our church. Mary Kent was our first organist, and they came from Trinity Gateway Lutheran Church with several other people to help to plant Peace Lutheran Church. John was our first council president and served in ways. Both of them retired or moved back to a Milwaukee area from Fort Myers, and both of them have died to the Lord. Rod and Clarice Hendrickson are from the Minneapolis area and still worship with us at Peace. Beulah Schlomer and her husband Freddie were wonderful people. Freddie has died, but Beulah is still worshiping with us. And Beulah at this time is either 100 or 101 or 102. We're not really sure. We had both her 99th and her 100th birthday party. But Beulah is a person who continues to believe you got to keep working forward and enjoy life and to let grudges and anger go. I think that's what's helped her to live as long as she has. Paul and Gail Arnfelt from Owatonna, Minnesota, are a wonderful couple. Gail died into the Lord several years ago, and they lived on Sanibel. Remember them wonderfully. Dot Mihalko comes from Kane, Pennsylvania. There's not too many Pennsylvania people beside Pastor Walter here in the church, but a few others. But Kane, Pennsylvania, a small town in northwestern Pennsylvania. And Dot was always a lot of fun. John and Lil Zenzen came from Minnesota. They were a part of a grocery chain up there and continued to worship with us for many years until they both died to the Lord. Norm and Nancy Thinschmidt are still a part of our congregation. They're from New Jersey. They're very concerned because their home congregation is declining there. But we are so blessed that they are a part of our congregation. The next couple, Marge and George Brooks. I'm just going to step aside for a moment to get something that I have from our archives. Because George and Marge Brooks were, again, very important leaders of our church that really helped to cast the vision for what Peace Lutheran Church could be. They were both from North Dakota, and George was one who owned radio stations. And I have something from his son's obituary that I'd like to read for you about George Brooks. As our growing family moved to each new town, George moved up in the world from salesman or reporter here to news or sales manager there, to a general manager, and finally to the owner of the radio station in Red Wing, Minnesota, KQAM and FM Red Wing. While at KQ, as we called it, he read the news every noon for at least 20 years. To all the farmers and cows within a 50-mile radius, he was must-hear radio. George helped us to find our land that we now have, and he also was one to always welcome people. He loved to know people, and he says, Pastor Walter, when you're standing in a grocery line, and if you don't know the person's grandmother within 30 seconds, you haven't done your job. He loved to be able to know and to appreciate people. Charlie and Carol Rao were people that came to us from Ohio, and it was when I first met Charlie, as I was part of a Bible study of mine, I looked at him and said, Charlie, are you a pastor? Because you just have tremendous knowledge. Have you been to seminary? He says, no, he's been studying, and he became one of our wonderful small group leaders. He led a small group at Sunflower Cafe before we had a facility, and people loved Charlie. And Carol was a person that brought to us the idea of having prayer shawls. Dick and Lois Berg were from Minnesota, and Dick really helped us in many ways with organizing our finances as well as stewardship. He was a very dedicated steward of the Lord, and the many riches that, the blessings that he had, he saw all coming from God. And so Richard and Lois Berg are people we celebrate. Walter and Ruth Ann Stinson are still part of our church. I think they're from Canada, and so we're very blessed to have them. Don and June Sether. Don was the second council president of our church, and we liked Don because he was a Mason and connected with the Masonic temple where we met on Pine Ridge Road. And so Don was the one who would often go and help the Masons understand what we were doing, especially as we kept trying to stretch our footprint within their facility. I really liked working with Don, and June loved to collect shells out on Sanibel Island. Joyce English is the person that helped us get Pastor George Frank, the connection I shared earlier from the New Jersey connection. Joyce has since moved back to New York to be by her family. And I always remember Joyce was blessed to have a granddaughter who was born with vision issues, almost leading perhaps to blindness. But Jenna was the little girl's name, and every week I saw, how's Jenna doing? Well, Pastor Walter, she loves to see the world, and she's going to have the world by the tail, and always gave us a message of hope and promise. Peggy Wolenslagle came, I think, from pretty close to Cedar Rapids, Sandusky, Ohio, to the park there. And Peggy helped us out in the office and many other things that she would do with us. Here we have Dick and Jerry Prochaska from Rochester, Minnesota. Mr. P, he was called because he owned grocery stores in Rochester. And Jerry was his very faithful helper. Dick and Jerry helped to get us into Habitat for Humanity, organizing days of painting. And there were times, especially in the early 2000s with the building boom here in Lee County, that all of the habitat, all the trim for the Habitat for Humanity houses was painted by somebody from Peace Lutheran Church. And they brought many people and really helped us to understand what it was to be servants in our church. Wonderful people. Mr. P. Dick has died, and Jerry, I believe, is in Minnesota. We next go on to Betty Jean Pyle. Her sister Betty Lou and she were born prematurely as twins, close to 100 years ago. And Betty Jean and Betty Lou, both of who were a part of Peace Lutheran Church, told me that their mom kept them in a little shoebox in a drawer by the stove when they were born because they didn't have fancy hospitals. And Betty Jean probably made it to age 94, and Betty Lou is 95, 96, 97 now. And so we remember her, and she says, "Live your faith." We next go on to Joyce Jensen. And this is Joyce Jensen, who helped to start and to work with Marge Brook to start our Sewing for Peace group. Here, she and Walter have the 2 doves that they have between each other that they're sharing with a bird of peace. So we're thankful for them. Or this might be there's another Jensen too that I've forgotten about. That might be theirs, but I forget their story. Here we have Bev and Ray Gerds from Wisconsin, who are still a part of our congregation. The Razicks, I don't remember. Don and Laura May Humner were from Madison, Wisconsin, from Bethel Lutheran Church, and they often talked about that wonderful congregation. Here we have Connie Wolf from Ohio, George Carter, who I believe was from Indiana. Here we have my parents, Carl and Helen Still from Columbus, Pennsylvania, who are still living, and they certainly wanted to support me in the mission here. Here's Marilyn and Warren Hibben. They're from Aurora, Ohio, friends of Jerry Pilmer's. And the wonderful story about Warren is that he had bypass surgery, and the day that he was to be discharged, they found complications, and so he had to have many other surgeries, and he was in the hospital and rehab facilities for months. We would faithfully visit him. Well, finally the day came when Warren was able to come back to church in a wheelchair with an artificial leg. But it was one of the happiest moments of reunion as we saw Warren come back to church, because quite honestly, I told him, I said, "Warren, I've written many funeral sermons for you, and I'm glad I haven't had to use them." But he has died recently after moving back to Illinois. This is Marion Caraway, another one of the wonderful people who helped to plant Peace Lutheran Church from St. John's Lutheran Church in Grafton, Wisconsin. And Marion invited her home congregation to be our mission partner early in our ministry. And I think they were for 5 or 6 years. She was a part of the first time of worship service here off island, and blessed us in many ways, and continues to love to listen to our live stream every time that we're on. And we love to visit her. Ron and Lorene Thompson are from Rochester, Minnesota. And Ron was a person that managed income tax stores, H&R Block up there, and quite a good, interesting fellow. I'm sorry, I just can't read who that person is from, and I'm sorry, I apologize for this. Here's Ernie and Betty Lou Pyle, who I told you about earlier, were from North Dakota. From Fargo, North Dakota. They both had a sugar beet farm, as well as Ernie was a banker. Even one time ran for the governor. Ernie said to me, "Pastor Walter, if you ever want to see 5 years go by quickly, get a 5-year note." He was very helpful to us in our church and recognized the fact that starting a new church is an expensive operation, and even maintaining a church. But he was always an ambassador for doing the good work of the church. Their daughter, Marcia, became an ELCA pastor, and Marcia would come down here and preach, and she'd often say, "Now, Pastor Walter, I'm willing to say some things that maybe you need to say, but you're not comfortable with. What do you need to say?" And I said, one time she helped me to help the people understand is that people that come to Fort Myers to retire didn't come here to die or to retire, but to continue to be disciples of Jesus Christ. I really appreciated when Marcia shared that message. Sadly, a few years after that, Marcia herself died of cancer at a young age, and I miss her visits tremendously. Bob and Joyce Kalstead were from northern Minnesota, a wonderful people, and I once visited them. They had small horses and were very nice people and part of the early people that helped to plant Peace Lutheran Church. Another person here is Hank and Mary Scheig. Hank was the CEO of AAL, Aid Association for Lutherans, and they came down here seasonally. He was a powerful leader, and his wife Mary was so gracious and also so very helpful. They loved Peace Lutheran Church, and they loved the church throughout the world, quite honestly, and they were travelers throughout the world, and we were very thankful to have them as a part of our church. Both of them have died to the Lord after moving back to Wisconsin. Now we're coming down to the end here. We have Alan Shea and Joni Erickson from Manitowoc, Wisconsin. We have Jim and Elaine Shanley. What wonderful people. They helped us in so many ways. They came from the Poconos of Pennsylvania, and they had a business there called Garden Gate, where it was a nursery. Jim helped us in many ways in our early leadership as a vice president of our congregation, and Elaine was the financial secretary and also was very generous to give us the gift to help us to buy our first organ. We were very blessed by Jim and Elaine. Next we come to Pastor Jorgen Vogge. And Pastor Vogge worked with Lutheran social services in Minnesota and the Dakotas, and was always an ambassador for us, helping others around our community. One of the first acts of charity that I heard of from this congregation was that at coffee hour at that time, they put out a little basket. And the gifts from that basket did not go to pay for the coffee, but were rather saved to be used for charity. There was a time when the Red River Valley flooded, and Pastor Vogge was asked to go back to help in the rehabilitation efforts, starting something called the Noah School for kids that did not have other schools to go for. But I was so proud when I heard that the leaders of Peace Lutheran Church voted that the funds from the coffee fund would go to help to support Pastor Vogge in his ministry. Pastor Vogge, several years later, died sadly, and we blessed to have his funeral on a Sunday morning because for Pastor Vogge, worship was the center of his life, and it was a beautiful time of gathering as a part of our Eucharist. Bud and Dee Dee Ott, wonderful people, always sat in the front left side of the church. Bud was a school superintendent in Ohio. Dee Dee was a person that worked in a support role as in the office. And Dee Dee became deaf. And she was able to read our lips to understand what we said. And sometimes we would even have people that would interpret sign language for her. But we very much appreciated. Bud was always a very important leader, part of our steering committee, and continued to guide us through some rough waters by his wise advice. I also remember that Bud, when we needed a sound system for our church, said, "I'll go buy it." And he did, and we used it for many, many years, both at the Masonic Temple and here at church, at Peace. Doris Tozo is a wonderful person. Her daughter Carolyn is still a part of our congregation. Doris came from Buffalo, New York. And the reason why she came to Peace is that she heard it was a mission congregation, and she had helped to start several other mission congregations. And she knew that this would be a place where she could use her talents. Doris wasn't a tall woman, but yet she had a wonderful way of sharing her faith and love and mercy. And so it's a joy to see her parish quilt square here. Jim and Karen Duff were a part of our congregation. They came from Gloucester, Massachusetts. Jim helped us out for a while as a secretary in our church, and Karen was our first parish nurse. What a wonderful story that was. We had received a $1,000 gift from St. Armand's Key Lutheran Church for development of our staff. And I had also been talking to the hospital about finding ways to get additional money. And we decided to have a meeting one day with the coordinator of the parish nurse program. And we said, well, we're going to come together. We're going to see what this $1,000 can do for us. Well, the parish nurse coordinator arrived with a big smile on her face because she told us that we had been awarded a grant from the Blue Foundation of Florida, as well as another congregation in the area, in order to serve both our parish as well as the local community. And so Karen, not only, I think she worked 5 hours a week at our church and 5 hours a week at Brightest Horizons, working with the moms and the kids, which was a real love for Karen in that wonderful ministry in Harlem Heights. Dick and Betty Perry were from Minnesota and also had for a while owned a ranch in Colorado. He was a corporate executive and helped us in many ways in our leadership, and we're very blessed by their work with us. Over in this square are some other people who didn't have time to sign or make a quilt square, but they too are important. So my friends, this day I've been able to show you a few of these squares and tell you just a bit of the stories from these people. They and many, many others have blessed us. You know, the great worry of some of these leaders as I think about them here today, just to kind of end this story, their great worry was this. They said to me, Pastor Walter, how will you know if we make this big investment with the stewardship, with the gifts God has given us for planting Peace Lutheran Church, how will we know if more people will come to be a part of this mission, or will it just sink? That was a really tough question to hear. But yet I thought it was a real question to work with. And I think in many ways I have to be like the Gospel of John, who when John was opening up the story of Jesus to Nicodemus, said, come and see what God has done at Peace Lutheran Church. There have been hundreds of people that have become a part of our church, and every year we have thousands of people that have worshiped with us. We are indeed blessed, and I believe placed in a very wonderful place to serve the Lord as a congregation, reaching the people of this congregation as well as reaching out into the world. In many ways, as I'm concluding my ministry here at Peace Lutheran Church, I'm reminded of a quote of Martin Luther. He said that while Philip Melanchthon and he sat in Wittenberg and drank beer, the Holy Spirit reformed the church. I feel the same way about Peace Lutheran Church. It's been the Holy Spirit that has gathered the people together and will continue to gather the people together. These people's stories are wonderful, but the stories that we will continue to hear for decades to come will fill this place and fill our world with faith, hope, and love that I know we will all celebrate. I give thanks for this time that we've shared together today. I apologize for any errors that I've made in my presentation to the family members, perhaps, that would have a different story. But it's been a privilege to share this time with you. May God bless you, and maybe someday some of you would be courageous enough to create another quilt that will show how Peace Church is serving the Lord. Thank you, and may God bless you always.